Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I would like to start this with the Fatimiya Sufi order greeting of Nur Alaikum. Tonight, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by my brother Matt Douglas of the Fatimiya Sufi order, who returns for part 7 in the series of dialogues and conversations that we're having. And in part 7, brother Matt will talk about himself being an ex-Baha'i and the toxic positivity that he has seen and observed, and also his observations and any guidance that he will give. We always appreciate him. So without further ado, Nur alaikum to Brother Matt Douglas. Welcome.
Nur alaikum, Salman. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, my brother. And please take it away.
Okay, well, this is kind of a follow-up, you might say, to the four-way podcast that you and me did also with Stephen Bayer and Sheikh Wahid Azal.
Mm-hmm.
And this one's going to be just, somewhat more personal.
Mm-hmm.
With some of the experiences I had, although even though I'm going to be talking a decent amount about my experiences with toxic positivity in the Baha'i faith, because the Baha'i faith is you might say, a Western religion, despite its claims it's quite colonial.
Yes.
Just the way, and so therefore you would say a Western religion, much like Judeo-Christianity. So I think that, and from what just from experience, so to speak, and other people's stories, I think many people who grew up with some sort of religion or spirituality, despite whatever gifts it may have given,
Mm-hmm.
with the Judeo-Christian world, will find parts of what I'm saying eerily familiar.
Right. Right. And in my observation, Brother Matt, I've seen this as a how like you have new age groups that claim fluff and love and light and all that stuff, but also there's an element of very deep and steep darkness that's also embodied in its hierarchy, its membership, its organizations. This is what I have observed from my personal opinion in the Baha'i faith as well. You do have the aspects of colonialism, but they also target white liberals and those in the Western countries who are open and prone. It's basically predatory in a way.
Yeah, it is. It is. One thread, though, that it often runs through in some form or another is some sort of shaming.
Yes.
We see this in the Judeo-Christian world. We kind of see this in original sin is probably the big one.
Yeah, that's correct.
Although that's probably the most common example, but there's certainly many other shades and stripes of it in the Judeo-Christian world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Baha'i faith really actually does seem to not talk about that in many ways, but
Mm.
that shame still comes out in many others.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, hey, we've reformed it. We're not shame based. Oh, yes, we are. So that's what I'm going to touch on from a slightly more personal level, and also just like I said, I think although I'm going to be talking about my experiences, and some of this will be in some ways a plea to those in the Baha'i faith that I'm still friends with to get the hell out.
Yes.
um, there's also at least a say, well, at least if you're not going to do that, at least recognize that this is kind of screwed up, and to be fair, just as in a lot of the Judeo-Christian religion, there are some people who don't really buy into some of the toxic aspects and don't perpetuate them. There are, in fairness, some Baha'is who don't, but um, it certainly wasn't the case for me and my family and a lot of what I experienced.
Well, that's certainly appreciated, brother Matt, because all of the wisdom you have offered, you are somebody that has been inside the faith, have seen its ups and downs, and are making this plea for not just for the betterment of all people, but for your friends that you still love and you care about because you wish well for them. So you are someone that has that inside experience. So there is no bias of any kind because you know what you're talking about, and in that regard, your wisdom and what you're about to share is truly appreciated.
Oh, thanks. I don't want to say I'm unbiased. I mean, well, yep, maybe technically. I'm certainly. I won't say it's without emotional charge for me.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
because there are people I care about.
Yes.
Yet at the same time, I think that some of what I talk about will kind of ring a chord with plenty of people who never even heard of the Baha'i faith if they listen up, but grew up in some other religious community.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not of course because you know we're religious ourselves as Bayanis of the Fatimiya, and which um is heavily Islamic as well. That
Mm-hmm.
um we're certainly not saying that we're certainly not dissing religion in and of itself, despite whatever um however much people might have been hoping for that at the beginning if they just heard our opening. No, we're not. Um, but we do have to acknowledge the reality that these things can very easily seep in.
Yes.
Um, so to me, as someone who's now a Bayani, well, also known as a Babi or a Zali,
Mm.
probably the Baha'is listening will uh, definitely recognize the term Babi as uh, follower of the Bab.
Yes.
Um, Perhaps the greatest element of toxic positivity
Mm-hmm.
in the Baha'i faith is actually their how they portray the early Babis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot's been said on how the Baha'is have co-opted the Bab, and I don't really need to repeat all that between myself, um, Sheikh Wahid, and plenty others. I think that's already been capped fairly well.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but just kind of speaking from like a personal insider experience, when you grow up in the Baha'i faith, by and
Mm-hmm.
large, and like I said, there's some people in it who don't perpetuate the BS, just as there's say Catholics who, despite it being imperial religion, don't perpetuate all the BS.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what you're told is that the early Babis were so spiritual, if you will, so enlightened or whatever, so filled with divine love. Um, to pick your adjective. Um, that they were happy and fulfilled to undergo the torture of martyrdom,
Mm-hmm.
almost to the point that pain was bringing them closer to God. Maybe they didn't actually even feel pain; it was actually bliss. you know. Um, and eventually you realize that that's frankly bullshit. Um, Pain is pain. It hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wasn't there experiencing or go through the experiences of any of these early heroes. That's their experience.
Now, how about yourself personally, Brother Matt? Let's say, any negative situations or circumstance or any kind of a gaslighting or toxic positivity that you yourself have experienced or witnessed in the Baha'i faith?
Well, see, here's what I'm building towards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what this does, this is not just a. I'm not saying this because I don't think it's factually true, although that's certainly the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the way this really messes with your head when you're a kid.
Yes.
Um, and while Mirza Hussein Ali, who Baha'is refer to as Baha'u'llah, didn't specifically say this about the early Babis, there are certainly plenty of passages of his that would say that he preached this attitude in general.
Mm.
Um, it's just where it says things like, whose dart is the nearest wish of those that love thee, and the true lover yearneth for tribulation, and things like that. I mean, I clearly got the message when I was a little kid that if you're truly spiritual, or throw in your adjective, that you'd be happy in any way, and you'd be like these early Babis who didn't feel pain, and they were tortured and all this sort of thing.
Right.
Um,
You were able to recognize that from a young age.
well, actually, no, not really. It took me some growing to
Mm-hmm.
realize that was a bunch of shit. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
um, it certainly seems strange to me, but there are some things that if you're told enough, you just kind of don't question.
Yes.
Um, and it takes a little bit of experience to go, wait a minute, what the fuck? This ain't right. Um, but I mean, when you're told that, it is a tool of extreme shaming.
Mm.
If you're not, oh, you're feeling pain or you're sad, you're not God. It's clearly the message I got.
Mm.
Um, I remember one time, even my maternal unit, um, I was complaining about something, and it was probably I forget what the heck it was, honestly. And granted, I don't think I could have been more than 10 or 12 years old.
Mm,
Um, and you're 10 or 12, you make complaints about things, but being, silly whining complaints about stuff. It's part of being a kid. Um, I remember her pulling out a small book entitled "The Suffering of Baha'i," and she was here. You're whining. You learn about real suffering. Um, as if as if to shame me into shutting up. Um,
mm-hmm.
Now in the adult world, I would think there are adults who bitch too much over little shit. Um, Certainly, I'd apply that to a hell of a lot of racist white people. Um,
Yes.
but even then, I'm never gonna say somebody can't feel bad over stuff. Just keep it in perspective. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's if a white person, for example, and this subject, of course, never. Well, I mean, racism came up plenty, but this sort of dynamic certainly never came up in my childhood. If you're a white person and a black person does not like you simply for being white,
Mm,
it's okay to feel a little sad. Just keep it in perspective that the reverse situation is loaded with far a huge backlog of historical trauma that your situation is not.
that's right.
Um, that doesn't mean you can't feel a little sad. I don't think anybody says that.
Mm,
Unless they're just trying to again be really shame based. Um, if they keep whining on, yeah, I might call them a bit of a wimp. you know, if they insist, if they keep insisting that it's all the same, um, if they're just like, well, I just kind of feel bad about. Okay, yeah, go ahead and feel bad about it. Um, but again, this is the adult world, and kids are not adults, and kids cannot handle some of the things that adults should be handling.
mm-hmm.
Um, so when you're given the message as a little kid that, you know, if you're sad, you're somehow not right with God, or you wouldn't be sad,
Mm-hmm.
it messes with your head. And there are some Baha'is who do not perpetuate that bullshit, but it is not the majority of
Mm,
them. Um, and I definitely think this flavor runs through a lot of Western religion slash spirituality.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and
but
I noticed that too. I mean, even if you look at a lot of Western spiritual groups or esoteric groups or groups that are claiming love and light, let's say in their groups, in their cliques, in their speaker panels, you won't find a non-white person that's included as somebody who's there to share whatever their experience is. So I've seen that even in the spiritual and religious community. So I'm glad that you have pointed that pattern out for those that recognize it.
yeah, I could, been much said on the subtle and sometimes not so subtle
Mm,
ism that exists within the Baha'i faith, despite their claims. Um, from the founders themselves.
mm-hmm,
Um, you know, I won't bother going into that here,
mm-hmm,
but it is, despite, like I said, that there's a flavor of shame in a lot of Western religion. This whole if you're sad and down, or even in pain, you're somehow not quite right with God, is something that is, I don't want to say completely unique, but almost unique, or almost very specific trademark, if you will, or oddity of the Baha'i faith.
yeah. I mean, you look at the toxic positivity that comes along with that. You have those in religious positions, even here in the West, that are committing acts of abuse or other acts of, not good behavior. But they would tell to control their constituents. They would tell them, "This is what God wants, and I'm basically the person in charge, and don't question my decisions and things like that." Right?
Yeah, well, that same flavor is there. Now they'll tell you on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that you're supposed to investigate the truth for yourself.
Yes.
Um, but the Baha'i advanced course is investigate the truth for yourself, and then if you're truly doing that, then you will inevitably bow to my authority.
Understood.
Um, as I've said before, you know, and the age you're supposed to do this is 15. Um, a 15-year-old going through the American public school system is not exactly politically educated to be able to um, do that with a whole lot of competence.
Yeah.
Um, but the kind of the point getting at is that, um, for example, despite the fact that the story of the crucifixion of Christ has been bastardized and abused in countless ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Christians will not only not stoop so low,
Mm-hmm.
try and say that Christ didn't feel any pain on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually to say that is an official Christian heresy.
Mm.
It's not like something they regularly throw around, but it is an official church heresy that, even though I think it might have been coined by the Catholics and they have their imperious colonial BS. Um, I think it's certainly, as far as I know, it's certainly carried over into Protestantism as well. It's called Docetism,
Yes.
and it's the idea, the notion that Christ, being fully divine, was not also somehow fully human too. Hence,
Mm-hmm.
it experienced human things like pain.
Mm.
Um, it is an official church heresy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Actually, reading about that heresy in, let's say, my early 20s, that I was, whoa, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
I've been working in the Baha'i faith pretty fucked up. But yeah, that it is an official church heresy. Now, I'm not saying there aren't Christian parents or other authority figures who might use the Christian crucifixion story to throw some shame on kids. Um, but the church, and the theologians recognize that that's something you ain't supposed to do.
Mm.
That's not the case in the Baha'i faith.
Mm.
And so there's a whole lot more of that level of shaming
Mm-hmm.
that occurs, and yeah, you might. I mean, kids cry and mope over some shit sometimes that we adults find kind of whiny, but telling them they shouldn't doesn't work.
Yeah.
Matter of
Yeah.
fact, this is what they might even more.
Mm-hmm.
And where was I going with this? Hold on, my train of thought derailed, and it's coming back.
Sure, sure. Take your time, my brother.
Uh,
I'll appreciate it.
yeah. Um, if I haven't said it before, I really don't like reading from note cards, and I kind of go on memory, so I can just kind of talk from the heart. But occasionally, the train of thought derails, and it has to come back.
Yeah, no
Um,
worries.
uh,
But yeah, that's the thing. I mean, see what we're dealing with right now in humanity is there's a lot of gaslighting, there's narcissism, there's the toxic positivity. I mean, if you're pointing out a problem, if there's, let's say you're in a place and there's a fire happening and everyone's has the smile on their face and ignoring the fire, and eventually that fire is going to swallow everyone whole if they don't wake up from their illusion and see what's going on.
yeah. Um, so yeah, that it now. A few corollaries, I guess, on this one. First, now there are stories. People will probably be asking, some people who grew up in the Baha'i faith, or people who have heard stories from Baha'is or whatever, might say, but, Matt, there are these stories about these early Babis who, supposedly had smiles on their faces when they were being tortured. And well, yeah, there are those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that doesn't mean that they were so spiritual they weren't feeling pain.
Yeah.
Here, I think, is the much more humane take on that.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Babis who are I mean, I hate to just kind of throw a blanket statement on here, but an oppressed minority who was
Yes.
getting persecuted and tortured.
Mm-hmm.
And the Babis didn't take it. They fought back when they could. But of course, they're only human. And, well, if they get you bound in chains or some other sort of restraint, then, well, that kind of makes fighting back a bit difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're about to go, you're about to get killed by your oppressor,
Mm.
and you probably don't have any capacity to take them with you.
Mm.
Give them a hell of a mind fuck on your way out.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, do something. Now, I mean, obviously, there are, because if you look at history, the odds on you successfully using a compassionate appeal to change their heart don't work. Especially because, these oppressors are training people to be hard hearted.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if you look at the the Middle Ages, during the particularly cruel reign of the Catholic Church, there was a book called, I think it was like it's like it was a double M Latin name, right? Like Malefic Maleficarum, something like that. But it's basically a book encouraging the torture of witches, and that even say, don't look a witch in the eyes or she'll cast a spell on you. And well, what they're actually doing is telling people not to look someone in the eyes so that they don't feel compassion and realize what they're doing is inhumane cruelty. Um,
Yes, that's right.
so so the ads on, and I'm sure um, the Kharja state uh, trained their torturers in a similar manner. So the odds on trying to appeal to their compassionate side was out the window. And if you
Mm,
look at history, there aren't too many cases of people stopping torture, realizing they're being um, horrendously cruel sons of bitches. This
mm,
is just not. I mean, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but it's pretty damn rare.
mm,
Um, so go down fighting in some way, mess with their head.
mm,
Yeah, we can totally look at that as heroic, and yet that doesn't throw the shame on the younger kids, and even the specific explanation might take a little while to gel, as they grow into what they're doing, but it's not gonna throw the stigma and mess with their heads the way it is if you start saying, to them, "Oh, therefore, this is how how you should behave too." You
mm,
know, little 7, 8-year-old kid.
mm-hmm,
um, Furthermore, there are, because no matter how messed up
mm-hmm.
any particular organization may be,
Yeah.
humanity is humanity, and you can't fully stamp it out. And
Mm-hmm,
so, are within the Baha'i faith, like there's in the Middle East, there are many people that something's a little messed up and try to address the problem and do something about it and change stuff or at least help out. I mean, that exists. Um, so realizing that, you know, there are Baha'is who realize that the Baha'i faith, despite not being able to get to the point of really questioning its foundation in and of itself, at least realize, there are problems within it and try to do some reform, if you will.
yeah.
And that took on the flavor. Um, I took on, how that one way in which that did manifest is, Baha'is trying to form some sort of support group, those that had, say, psych or counseling background or something. Um, and realizing that, there was a lot of benefits to therapy and, support groups and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm,
Um, there was, I think it formed back in like 70s or 80s and was then called uh, BERF, which stood for Baha'is in Recovery Fellowship, which later changed its name to BANASA, Baha'i Network for, I think it was AIDS, Spirituality, Abuse, and Addiction. Um, I'm not even sure if that, it was going for a while. I'm not sure if it still exists or not. But it was something, there were was an organization within the Baha'i faith that had their own conferences and things like that. And of course, though, there were plenty that were opposed to it as well, saying, "Oh, but if they just study the writings, they'll be okay," kind of crap. But what I started thinking about, actually, kind of recently, when I was on this whole topic, starting to think about talking about this topic, yeah, there were those within who recognized, for lack of a better term, the benefits of therapy and wanted to bring it in, realizing, hey, we Baha'is get problems too. I realized there was one big hole. And as I've mentioned before, because the persecution narrative in the Baha'i faith is overblown, twisted, but as I have acknowledged, when you have, when you are a Baha'i in Iran that has a
Your voice quality went down.
okay, as I was saying, when you are, the persecution narrative of the Iranian Baha'is is greatly exaggerated, as I've said in podcasts before, and myself, Sheikh, and others have gone into some pretty big detail about. And it doesn't make the fact that there are some stories that are real and some that
Are you on speaker? Sorry to interrupt you. Are you on speaker?
no, well, sort of. I think it's kind of automatic. Let's see.
Yeah, see if you can get that off speaker. It was good before.
Okay, I didn't change anything. Hold on a sec. Um, oh, wait a minute. I think I hit mute there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, please keep going.
Okay. All right. Okay. As I was saying, there are, despite the persecution narrative being greatly exaggerated for political purposes, namely for the West, especially like the U.S. and U.K. You suck, as I like to sum it up. Against Iran. That doesn't mean that because Baha'is in Iran nonetheless have a world headquarters in Israel. Yes, you have to be kind of a moron if you think there aren't spies within. But sadly, there are many who won't be, but who end up guilty by association. And sometimes, tragic actions from the Iranian state upon them are the result. And because of this, also there have been, like I said, I've known a few people who I saw the scars with, and I knew that was real. But there are other people who kind of brag publicly about being tortured, which I think the way they did it was very different. You might say, who actually showed me some scars at one point or another. I think they were just capitalizing on the hype for some attention.
Yes.
There, but it's kind of naive to think that phenomenon wouldn't go on. But what's funny about when Burf and Banassa were going, maybe still are going, and all these stories of persecution are told within the Baha'i faith community, sometimes even reminders from the administration of, pray for our brothers and sisters in Iran.
Mm.
Once, not once in my entire time as a Baha'i in the Baha'i community did I ever once hear about the need or the desire to provide counseling and therapy for Baha'is who went through supposed torture and persecution from the Iranian state.
Mm.
Not once.
Mm-hmm.
And if, which is not to say that it's all fake, because like I said, yes, there were some very real tragedies, but I think that really speaks to the positivity of, here they are trying to talk about this tragedy, which again is greatly exaggerated. If I've gone into this in other podcasts, but here is, the U.S. National Assembly of Baha'is, despite, greatly using the persecution narrative for political purposes. When you read their supposed official stats, they say there are 300,000 Baha'is in Iran, and they talk about how they're persecuted just for their beliefs and thrown in jail just for being Baha'is. When you actually read their stats on how many Baha'is are in jail allegedly for just being Baha'is, it's 90 some. I think 91 was the
Mm.
last stat I read. And you got to wonder, okay, what happened? Why, if supposedly the Iranian state jails people just for being Baha'is, why aren't the 299,909 others not in jail? um,
Mm-hmm.
but if they're going to play this narrative, here they are pumping out this narrative. And as I said, because there likely are some spies, and this is an organization with ties to an enemy country,
Mm.
the hammer is going to get swung on some people, and sometimes it's going to be swung on people who are guilty merely by association, sadly. Why is there no, absolutely none whatsoever
Mm.
call for, those who manage to escape or even within, why is there never a call for therapy or counseling or some sort of trauma recovery service for these people?
Mm.
And I think that really speaks to the toxic positivity. And if you want confirmation on that it's there, then I think there's the proof, because there are, they can't make that call because, and so why I say it is institutional and not merely a mass fault of the Baha'i individual,
Mm-hmm.
is that if the Baha'i administration actually made that call to get these people, even like I said, some of the stories, probably are filtered. Now, again, some of them are real. If they made the call to get these people grief counseling, trauma counseling therapy,
Hmm.
then that would destroy the ability to use the stories of the early Babis who endured torture as a tool of shaming.
Mm-hmm.
And so you never hear that call, because then they couldn't start saying, oh, these early Babis are so spiritual, they enjoyed torture. We go out the
Hmm.
window.
I mean that's a good point because I mean, see, a lot of these organizations, not just the Baha'is, you'll have many of the leadership that actually knows the truth, while those on the lower levels are just, they're doing the work, they're putting in the work, they're the legs of the organization, while people at the top, those that are the administrators or those that are in some leadership position, they know the reality of what's going on, and unfortunately, the those that have a good nature, that are thinking that they're doing the right thing, unfortunately, they get duped into it as well.
Yeah, well, in a way, it's the very same tactic that a mafia uses, with
Yeah,
one
yeah.
but with one very, very big difference, in the sense that the people who do the grunt work for the mafia know they're the grunts,
Hmm.
and they know what their organization is really about.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
same thing applies to other organized crime groups, like biker gangs and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
but it's makes for a huge plausible deniability on the part of the people at the top.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't want to say, because everybody thinks in some way they have their rationalization that they're the ones doing good, but
Hmm.
in a criminal organization, like say a mafia, they at least know they're a criminal organization. They're really
Hmm.
the good guy being forced into this situation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but they at least know they're criminal. you know,
Yeah.
um, they don't have any illusions about that one. Um,
Hmm.
but you get an organization with nefarious political purposes, but preaching all love and light,
Hmm.
that um know the people doing the legwork, and even there
Hmm.
are parts of the legwork that aren't nefarious and aren't criminal. Some of it is helpful. Now, granted, there's really not too god awful much of genuine charity in the faith. If anything, I can speak to the fact that I was discouraged from organizing such.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I did what they call a year of service. They try to, they, Baha'is try to say they don't proselytize, and yeah, they do.
Hmm.
But they tone it down a bit to be oftentimes to be more subtle.
Hmm.
Um, but it's still kind of, it's still kind of is, it's still kind of is proselytization. Just,
Yes.
um, it's just, pillow over the hammer kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
but I remember when I was on it, because I was people who were putting me up when I moved out to Cali had, I was they were driving me into the center in the morning. Was one of them commuted to their work. but these folks had lived on a big orchard. It's California. You got a lot of citrus orchards,
Mm.
and I thought to myself, and of course, but they're not like professional farmers. Okay, they weren't regularly selling their crops or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, they just had a bunch of fruit trees on the property, and I thought of the idea, and this particular family was willing. I'm like, well, why don't I take some fruit in and give it out? Take some fruit into the center and give it out. Be helpful
Mhm.
to me. There's plenty of homeless people in Cali.
Yes.
Um, Actually, there's a lot of homeless people in Cali.
Well,
You know,
especially now, there's a L.A.,
before.
San Francisco. It's so much now with the inflation, and things are just out of control right now, my brother. I mean, even the middle class is on the verge of being one paycheck away from being homeless.
Oh yeah, and they're even predicting a food shortage come harvest time
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
this year. Um, yeah, but I mean, so things weren't that bad then, but there was still plenty of economic imbalance,
Mm.
economic, creating a lot of economic disparity. Even I mean, this is going 20 years ago. But there was still plenty back then, and there were plenty homeless in the area. And I thought it might be great if we're supposed to be of service to maybe provide a little food to any homeless person who wants to come by. I mean, it might not be a full meal, but it's citrus fruit. It's at least healthy. It's something. And I was told, no, no, don't do that.
Mm.
And not just from an individual, but from the local LSA. Um, you might make the argument there might have been in chambers some members who liked the idea, but no, ultimately the decision was not to do it.
Mm.
Um, which kind of again throws some real questions on their motives. Um, and I mean, heck, as I've said, Christianity certainly has been overwhelmed with colonially warped versions of it, but I
Mm.
will I will say that on the whole, Jews and Christians in the West are, and certainly Muslims in the West are a hell of a lot more charitable um, than the Baha'is.
Yes.
Now there are still some who manage to do charity work. Again, you can't fully stomp out humanity,
Mhm.
and but they make an effort in a lot of ways to really nix practical charitable work.
Mm.
Um, and write off indoctrinating children's classes as service work instead.
Right. I mean, I agree because those that actually are about love and light and they want to help people. I mean, you have Islamic organizations and other Jewish and Christian organizations that donate millions of dollars to so many causes, not just in America but all over the world. So
Oh yeah.
those that want to do the work, they're gonna do it. They're not gonna tell you, oh, if you go to China, do not take this document there, or they'll have like other deceiving tactics, which they're gaslighting people that stand up against them or gaslighting their own somebody that goes against the narrative, and they have people and especially in a lot of their rules and regulation where they're supposed to basically watch people who are criticizing them. So I mean that just all of it just seems criminal to me, honestly, with my honest opinion.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I did know of some Baha'is who set up, um, say like health clinics and things in some, poor countries. I'm not saying it's not done. Um,
But those people
but
did that on their own. They were
yeah,
most likely they were not encouraged by the institution and its teachings. They did that on their own.
mostly. I mean, occasionally they would get the Baha'i endorsement logo, for lack of a better term.
Mm.
Um, but you have to wonder, given my personal experience, like I have known people talk about, opening up clinics. Sometimes even they recognize that high clinics from poor countries like that. Yet charity at home was close to nil.
Mm.
At least outside the faith, it's like you definitely have to wonder, even though the people who did it were by and large, for the most part, genuine. When you look at the greater picture, you have to wonder if there was an ulterior motive for the administration allowing the Baha'i logo on such charity.
Hmm. I mean,
Um,
sometimes it's just for PR. I mean, I know many devious organizations that try to do other aspects of charities, but when somebody's there to interview them, it's all set up. The questions are pre-planned. Everything is pre-planned to make everything look nice and fluff, but that's not really the reality. It's like you have
yeah,
a lot of billionaires that supposedly seem like good people and they're donating monies to charity, but that's just for them to. I mean, they get a tax write-off for everything. Everything is
yeah,
501c3.
and they just plain got their money hoarding a hell of a lot more than they give away. you know?
Exactly. They get all of that back.
Yeah, and even if they don't, they're still the the charitable donation does not equivocate making up for the theft.
Exactly. That's it.
Um, so this is just to me, this is what I grew up in, and again, like I said, there are some who you can't, as I've said before, you can't fully squash humanity, and some goodness is going to come through, but there was a lot of really messed up stuff. There were a lot of efforts to quash that humanity, and there was a lot of shame used to do it.
Hmm.
And like I said, never once were victims of torture in the face, allegedly, because they were Baha'is. And like I said, some cases were BS. Some were probably very true, and I saw some scars. And never once was, um, were these people encouraged to get any kind of counseling. And
Hmm.
even on a, because if you're a religious minority, there's gonna, like as a kid, it's gonna be a little bit of weirdness just because you're in a group that is not what most of the other kids are in. So there's a little bit of stigma, and even though they might have like youth conferences and things where supposedly, might give each other support, the idea of it can be tough to be in a religious minority, and therefore there might be some grief that needs to be processed.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen. It's just, oh, come together and support each other and nothing but love, light, and smiles is more or less the way it goes down. So it doesn't allow the youth to process the emotion. Although, and I'm not putting this on the scale of, I'm not putting. I don't want to put awkwardness from being a religious minority, peer pressure kind of thing, on anywhere near the scale of actual torturous persecution. But that doesn't mean that it's not a phenomenon that needs to be dealt with compassion.
Hmm.
And again, the idea of actually allowing to kind of be sad and just accept that, kind of let them feel it isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Just be happy you're in this special group.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, that's it.
so
So,
and it,
do you have
and it,
any other thoughts or any closing remarks, my brother, on this subject?
I think I think I've kind of summed it up. I think I've
Oh,
kind of summed now because these as anybody who's listening knows, these are ongoing talks, and you know it's always possible I might think of a addendum to part 7 that I can shoehorn into part 8, 9, or 10. you know,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah. That sounds good, my brother. And I thank you for being here as always, and all of the parts that we have done, 1 through 7. It's always an enlightening experience. Always good to learn from your wisdom, and thank you for what you have shared. I look forward to welcoming you back in the future for part 8. So please say good night to the listeners, and yep, we will conclude this in part 8.
well, good night, everybody. This is a wrap. I'd like to say hope you've enjoyed it, but I'm really not going for enjoyment here. It's a tough world, and we got to address some serious problems. And I hope you've at least found it. What's the word I'm looking for? Beneficial, maybe.
Oh, that definitely it
I
was
don't want to say
definitely good.
enlightened. That's a little too cheery for the subject matter. Um, I hope you found it good.
Thank you, brother Matt. Nur alaikum, and yep, until we see each other for part 8.
Nur alaikum.